Thank you. It seems to be some kind of tradition that the General Secretary goes and eats something that disagrees with them just before this event. Geoffrey was reminding me that John Proctor went home early last time. Now, I was not quite sure I was going to make it, but thanks to Andy Braunston, who drove the van so that I didn't have to, I am here. But it's very good to be here, and it's very good to see you all, and it's very, very good to be gathered in person. I confess that before the first of these gatherings 4 years ago, I was just a little bit sceptical about the enterprise. And I was very, very quickly won round and remember it as something of a high point. It was engaging, refreshing, feeding, and just wonderful to catch up with so many friends. My prayer is very much that this event will be similar. And to that end, right at the beginning, I want to offer huge thanks to Geoffrey and the team of folk who have put this event together. It's an enormous piece of work, and also very particular thanks to Sam Bircham, who has done just magnificent work on trying to bring the practicalities of this event together, which, when you stop to think about it, is quite one logistical exercise. And she's been doing this, as it were, on top of her day job, not really quite as part of what actually is in the job description. I suspect a number of us know about things like that. So huge thanks to those who have made this possible. And who would have thought 4 years ago when we were gathered here what the next few years would bring? To speak of the challenges and opportunities that the pandemic is hackneyed and trite, but might well be true. Overnight, the world was turned upside down. We learnt to do things with technology many of us had no idea was even possible. We sat and prayed alone, commending the dead to God when funerals could not happen. We ensured those trapped without digital access to the wider world were not isolated and their basic needs were met. We discovered what Zoom is. Boy, did we discover what Zoom is. We found ourselves celebrating God's presence in the midst of life in bread and wine digitally. I spent just 6 weeks in pastorate ministry at the start of the pandemic before moving to this role, and experienced all of that and much more besides. And for those of you who have ministered in pastorate throughout this pandemic, with all its complex phases and developments and rule changes, its ups and its downs, it's actually hard to underestimate the scale of what has been achieved. New worshipping communities have emerged. We offer levels of access to worship and community for those who can't get out beyond our wildest imaginings a few years ago. There is story after story of those who've emerged into the life of the church and begun to explore their path of discipleship through these new digital ways. International links have deepened our Catholicity whilst we've never left home. But we're tired. My goodness, we're really tired. And we still don't really know what this pandemic, which whatever Boris tells us is still really rather with us, has done to us. As individuals whose experiences of the last 2 years have varied immensely, or as churches or the United Reformed Church. Some of us have revelled in the challenge of the new. Some have been ground down by the loss of so much we treasure, or a mixture of all of that. Some will live with trauma for a long while to come. And each time we chair a church meeting, we've got something of all of that around the table. the ultra-cautious, and those determined to pretend that nothing is really happening, united by baptism may be, divided over whether or not it's safe to serve a cup of tea at the end of worship. Or so it has felt in so many places. For those of us in ministry of all the varying kinds and in all the varying contexts we represent gathered here, the pandemic landed into the middle of what was already a deeply challenging context. We must keep perspective. We do not face the daily challenges of our siblings in the Middle East, or maybe those of our sisters and brothers in the Ukraine or Russia, where our Lutheran and Methodist friends with whom we are in full communion are doing remarkable work in impossible situations. Our context is not one of oppression, but it is one of profound secularization, a deep disinterest in institutional church. In the Western world, I suspect there has not been a more challenging time to live out the life of the body of Christ since the Reformation. It's a situation which has come upon us over generations, but one that still moves slowly enough that day by day or even year by year, it's easy not to notice it. But when one looks back, one realizes the speed of it. The church is a radically different place to what it was 27 years ago when I candidated for ministry. It was markedly different again by the time I was ordained 18 years ago. And in places, it's now unrecognizable. And yes, if any of you are doing the maths, I did do, as my mother came to say, longer education, more than ever was higher education. Some of you, I dare to say it, will have seen considerably more change over the course of your ministries than I have. And the pandemic has brought much of that into very sharp focus. Many congregations simply did not make it. It's still a bit early to really know, but my hunch is a good number of congregations that would have closed sometime in the next 4 or 5 years have closed because of this pandemic. There are those remarkable places, often rural, that have always been small, that moved church life to the telephone and the post through lockdowns and then have carried on much as before. But many did not. Many of us have been and are exercising a hospice ministry at the moment, a profoundly important ministry in so many ways. The power of a good death is significant. At the very heart of the gospel lies a good death. From a good death, new resurrection life becomes possible. But hospice ministry is draining and emotional. One is dealing with complex and raw grief, which gets projected around the place in all kinds of unexpected ways. Being the minister in the midst of that is tough. And to those who are doing that, the wider church owes you a profound debt of gratitude. Then there are churches which are lively and flourishing, who might well have grown in various ways through digital outreach in the pandemic, but who begin to question and wonder, as perhaps it would seem a third of regular congregations have not returned to in-person worship. Should we worry about this? Should we not worry about this? What does the privatization of worship in people's front rooms mean? Or is it simply too early to say? in a wider societal context where the very possibilities and conditions for believing have shifted from a context where one was just societally assimilated into faith and its practices to one where we are societally assimilated into disinterest in organised religion. This remains the background for all of what we are and do. And yet, too, it is a society where recent research showed that the huge proportion of young people who pray at least once a month, something I suspect my generation as young people in the schools I attended, that would have been very alien for. And then there are those things which prosaically change around us. I was hugely struck when I returned to pastorate ministry, including a couple of village congregations I had actually served my internship with, that after 10 years of being at Westminster College, the pattern of funerals had shifted considerably. When I'd been a student, funerals were a mainstay of ministry in those villages, and a mainstay in reality of evangelism and witness. Many folk were drawn to the edges of church life through first encountering us around funerals, and then would be drawn into the heart of the community and faith over time. Other than those with a very direct relationship to the church, funerals had rather disappeared in those 10 years. They go increasingly to secular celebrants. Except, interestingly, when the funeral director phoned me and asked me if I'd be willing to do a non-religious funeral in the church building, because it was a difficult one. The death of a 21-year-old in a motorbike accident whose father had died that exact same way 10 years previously and whose girlfriend was newly pregnant. His words to me were simply, "I don't trust the civil celebrants with this one. They wouldn't know where to begin." So off I went to see the family to find out quite what a non-religious funeral meant in this context. And it meant scripture readings, hymns, prayers, the standard commendation and committal at the graveside. Such is the confusion in which we minister. And at moments it simply does our heads in. And so we find ourselves ministering in the United Reformed Church as it reaches 50. We were perhaps not quite expecting to be here, and the quest for organic unity has ebbed and is no longer the ecumenical game in town. We're still fully part of the ecumenical movement. I was struck at the recent CTE forum at the role URC folk were playing. We sometimes say we punch above our weight, and in all kinds of ways we do. Not simply ecumenically, but one can look at other aspects of our life too. The work of the Joint Public Issues team, the impact we have in the public square. These are all areas of life where we thrive. You will find us too deeply engaged with the world church, even as we are learning the importance of reflecting on the shadow side of so much of our global past in the form of legacies of slavery and empire. I've heard the theologian Anthony Reddy speak a number of times of late, and I've heard him quote James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And the Jubilee of the United Reformed Church is perhaps a moment to celebrate the many gifts that the United Reformed Church has brought to life in and beyond the life of the churches in England, Scotland, Wales, and further afield. But it is also a moment, I believe, to face some realities that, unless we're willing to do so, will inhibit our ability to change. So I want to reflect just a little on some of the reflections of the Church Life Review Group and the work they are engaged with, which will, I think, shape quite a lot of our lives as we engage with this in the years to come. We met a couple of weeks ago and we were pondering metaphors for what we're about. We remain deeply committed to the reality that one last programme or mission strategy will not sort us out. It's tempting, but experience tells us that church life doesn't really work like that. Rather, we landed on the thought that what we might need to be about as a church is tending the vineyard. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Throughout Scripture, God is ultimately the vine grower. It is God who plants and tends and clears the ground and prunes. And some of this metaphor is deeply uncomfortable, for we have been pruned significantly in the last 50 years. We are a far smaller church than we once were. We can lament that, and indeed, lament very much has its place. But we also need to ponder what God might be about in pruning us so vigorously. And we should not lose sight of the fact that pruning is ultimately for the sake of new growth. Another vineyard image takes my attention, but mixes our metaphors a little. It is the fig tree that's found in a vineyard in Luke's Gospel. A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came looking for fruit on it and found none. So he said to the gardener, "See here, for 3 years I have come looking for fruit on this fig tree, and still I find none. Cut it down. Why should I be wasting the soil?" He replied, "Sir, let it alone for 1 more year, until I dig around it and put manure on it. If it bears fruit next year, well and good, but if not, you can cut it down." There is both that sense of threat and possibility hanging over this reading. The fig tree in this vineyard is expected to bear fruit, and so are we. But the fig tree is also tended, it is dug around, it is fertilized, cared for, that it might bear fruit. And we believe that the fruit of the vine, to continue to mix our metaphors a little, is overwhelmingly the ministry of our local congregations up and down the church. It is vital that congregations catch a vision of what they are called to and live into it. The wider church cannot do that for a local congregation, and indeed, I believe, should not. The wider church can, however, do what's within its power to make sure that the vine is healthy, that it is fertilized, that the nutrients can move around the vines freely, that the roots are freed to absorb that which they need from the ground. God is ultimately always the vine grower, but we are invited to work with God in tending our corner of the vineyard. So what are the issues we need to face if we are to stand any chance of changing? What kind of tending, fertilizing, and pruning do we need to engage with if we are to respond faithfully to the place that God has brought us over the 50 years of the URC? Let me name, first of all, that which I suspect many minds in this room turn to first as an issue: deployment. That the number of congregations has reduced far more slowly than the number of ministers means, as we can all testify to, we get spread ever more thinly. We will soon be at an average of at least 7 congregations per minister, an average. And some of us will already know what it means to be above average. For many of us, the profound changes we have noticed in ministry during our lifetimes finds a significant part of their origins in that reality. We too often feel pulled in every which direction at once. We often end up taking on functions which previously would have been done by volunteers in the life of the church because there is no one else to do them. We might promise at ordination to exercise leadership to the church in its mission to the world, but too often it can feel like if we've got every church we tend with a safeguarding policy, the financial accounts in order, the health and safety policy functioning, and the pulpits filled on a Sunday, then we might just be winning. And there were moments when, briefly, I had a hand in tending 7 congregations at once. I was not winning. We have noted right at the outset that deployment is a very real issue that must be grasped. However much we tell ourselves we are wonderfully constructing deployment plans which are mission-focused, which of course we're trying to do, we all know that the reality is we're spreading the jam thinner and thinner until, to mix our metaphors again, the pips squeak. And yes, we all know just how hard-pressed it is. Too many of us actively wonder if we can make it to retirement at quite the rate we're going. Too many of us feel that our vocation to ministry is barely able to be exercised in the context we're working in. Too many of us look at the vacancy list with something akin to fear and trepidation. Too many of us wonder at times whether we'd be better to go and find another corner of the vineyard to tend, and then can end up feeling very trapped. It is unfashionable, perhaps, to name this stuff so starkly, but that which we do not face cannot be changed. It will come as no surprise that we have no immediate magic solutions to any of this, but we do believe that if we can clear the ground around the roots of the vine, do some careful tending, fertilizing, and indeed pruning, there will be ways forward. I've already touched on one significant area that, if we're not careful, feels like we'll strangle the vine with creeper, and that is the whole compliance agenda. And here we are in a bind, for we believe in this stuff. We believe passionately that people must be kept safe, that we must steward and tend our resources responsibly and with care. We believe that our buildings must be places where people are safe and secure and can be given a real welcome, and yet we can so often feel overwhelmed by safeguarding and risk assessments and insurance requirements and health and safety and fire regulations, and the need to present reliable, accurate accounts in the form the Charity Commission can cope with, and to employ people in accordance with good HR practice. And I suspect this takes a vast amount of our time away from feeding congregations with the word, celebrating God's presence with us in bread and wine and water, and shaping communities in which all can flourish. We believe there can be and are ways in which we could significantly better support local congregations to deal with exactly this kind of thing. That will take money, of course, and structures to help deliver it. But we believe this is worth pursuing because the immediate benefit to freeing up the vine from the creeper to allow it to flourish would be considerably freeing for congregations and ministers. So what does it look like, I wonder, for a United Reformed Church to flourish? And what are local congregations looking for from the wider church to enable and equip their flourishing? This seems like a key question, and one that we have turned to the think tank Theos to help us answer. They have engaged in various research projects for churches and church agencies as they've been seeking to discern their future. They've worked with the C of E on social inclusion, with Churches Together in England, with cathedrals. They're specialists in qualitative research, where you actually turn up and have a conversation with people about what makes things work and what not. It's not an exercise in filling out a questionnaire that sometimes one feels is designed to force you to give the answers the person who wrote it is looking for. They will be working with a carefully selected set of local churches to be as representative as we can, to try and engage with them on what they believe flourishing looks like, what their experiences of flourishing are, and what the wider church needs to do best to support them in that flourishing. And we need, of course, in the midst of all of this, to think very carefully about our resources, particularly our financial resources. The pruning that has happened to the United Reformed Church in terms of church closures, something which is going to continue for quite a time yet, leaves us, perhaps ironically, with some considerable resources that look set to continue growing over time. In a recent 5-year period, looked at during the discussions around pensions, showed that the combined cash assets of the United Reformed Church at General Assembly and Synod levels combined had risen from 150 to 200 million pounds. And that's before we stop to consider the money that very many local churches are sitting on, very unequally of course, waiting for a rainy day. Folks, it's raining. I spoke earlier about the importance of a good death. We know about that in terms of individuals we will have ministered alongside the dying. We see just how remarkable a good death can be, where someone ends up at peace with themselves and those they love. A good death can lead to good grieving by those who are left behind, and lead to continued flourishing in life. And I suspect, too, we will have ministered alongside those who, for whatever reason, do not manage a good death. They fight it every step of the way, creating torrents of hurt and angst as they go. In church terms, I think part of a good death is when a congregation comes to a sense of peace about the fact that their ministry in this place has been concluded, and also where they come to a sense that their death might lead to renewed life elsewhere. As the seed dies in the ground, which gives birth to the tree, as the vine is pruned rigorously, enabling it to come back to renewed life, a good death is one which leads to a good life. We return again to the reality that at the heart of the gospel stands the good death of Christ. Yes, bloody, at the hands of a brutal empire and religious leaders who want him out of the way. But a death he set his face to, a death he did not seek to avoid, a death he had prepared for in those so important, simple things that can be life-transforming. Woman, here is your son. Here is your mother. As the beloved disciple goes on to give her a home. What we do with our money is in reality a question about how we live out our most fundamental convictions about death and resurrection. Most of our money is as the result of the death of congregations in ways that could never have been predicted 50 years ago. Do we build ever bigger barns? Or do we believe that the resources released as churches die can help fertilize and grow other churches, begin new communities of faith? We have a duty to tend our talents well, to make sure that the God-given resources we have, we're using as well as we possibly can. And it is to this end that we're engaging in some forensic accounting. It's amazing what you learn when you become a General Secretary. I had no such idea there was such a thing as forensic accounting. Of the money that we spend each year, about 60% is spent through M&M by the General Assembly, which funds our stipends, the training of ministers and CRCWs, education and learning more widely, and the operation of Church House. And the other 40% is spent by synods. That, of course, means there are 14 separate bodies spending money. And currently, we have almost no means of getting a global picture, therefore, of what we spend it on. It's also very hard, because of different ways of accounting for things, to know what wealth we sit on. We believe that some real transparency over all of this will help us to begin to discern wisely how we are called to use our resources. For we can't begin to find more realistic models of deployment or find ways of relieving congregations of some of the burdens of compliance without having a good sense of what resources are available to us. Where our money is, our heart is. When we find out where our money is and where it goes, we may well need to do a little soul searching to find out whether that's really where we want our heart to be. And pruning is also probably key. Some of this pruning is probably not too difficult. Famous last words, but we will be bringing for consultation to Assembly, not for final sign-off, but for consultation, proposals for a radical overhauling of our Central General Assembly committee structures. A structure that worked well for a much larger church that no longer exists, and it no longer functions. We struggle to find 500 people necessary to populate it. We struggle to keep the dots joined up between so many different committees that map oddly, to say the least, onto church house departments. We will have to give up some possibly treasured ways of doing things, and we will need to live into the reality that in a conciliar church, we do believe that we discern best together rather than apart. But that does not mean that every last operational decision must be taken by a committee. We should be discerning vision, strategy, and policy together, and have far more trust over the basic operational matters to let folk get on with them. Where pruning feels perhaps much harder is when it comes to recognising that some of our local churches are struggling to keep the very basics of the show on the road. And this often goes back to all those compliance things again, but it's not just that. When a congregation cannot call a functioning elders' meeting, when there are no basic officers for the life of a congregation, life becomes unsustainable. And we believe we need to be much more proactive in attending to congregations who find themselves in this place. It's about finding new ways to deal with structural matters. One church on more than one site, for example. It's about finding ways to tend a fellowship beyond the point where they can care for a building or the full responsibilities of church life as some kind of class or fellowship of another church, perhaps. And sometimes it may be about recognizing that the synod needs to take a difficult decision that a church needs to close. Our hope is that with careful reflection on what enables local churches to flourish and what that looks like, on what resources we have, on what meaningful action we can take to significantly relieve churches of the burdens of compliance that seem to strangle us, on a very realistic reflection on when we need to recognize that the mission of a local church has genuinely concluded in a place. Put all of that together, and there are some very real possibilities for flourishing, for new work, and perhaps for us here, ministries that feel like they are genuinely responding to a vocation of word and sacrament and community ministry to which we have and do feel called. And in all of this, we must not forget that one of the most significant gifts and blessings within the life of the church is sitting here in this very room. You folks. There is no greater gift to God's church than ministry. It sounds a little old-fashioned, possibly out of favour in some parts, but I believe there is no higher calling than to be a minister of the gospel. To feed Christ's church with the world, to enable the presence of Christ in the midst of the church in bread, wine and water, to build and tend communities, to exercise leadership of the church in its mission to the world, to pastor God's children through their lives of discipleship. This is an extraordinary gift and blessing. We live in a tradition that celebrates the ministry of the whole people of God, and I in no way want to undermine that. But sometimes I fear we downplay the vital significance of ordained and commissioned ministries, which are a lifelong vocation. I have sat in meetings where I have been told that as a minister I must by definition be actively inhibiting the people of God from taking their place and restricting the life of the church from its flourishing. And I do not believe this is true. Without the ministry that we engage with, a vital part of the tending of the vine would not happen. The flock would not be fed and watered and kept safe. The fruit would not flourish. Every time you sit at the bedside of the dying, every time you sit in an elders' meeting and it's one of those penny-dropping moments, every time a sermon hits a chord with someone, every time in messy church a child catches something of the amazing nature of God's expansive love for us, every time you fall into meaningful conversation with someone completely outside the normal context of the church, every time you are out and about in the community and available for people to reflect on their God-given lives with them, then something extraordinary is happening. Ministry is happening. And the church owes you all a huge debt of gratitude. And I pray that the next few days will be just a little thank you for that. One of the things that made me nervous about our last gathering was the seeming stated desire that we would not become introverted and navel-gazing and spend our time only reflecting on the woes of the URC, and therefore we were kind of discouraged on talking about it. I think my scepticism was misplaced. It was the first time we'd attempted something like this, and to be taken out of ourselves, to be taken into the wider church, to be taken into the realms of God's great grace for us was refreshing and restoring and reconciling. And I very much hope too that our programme this time will give us plenty of all of that. I did not believe, however, that to gather all our ministers together for a second time and not to offer some kind of reflection on where we are, not to name some of the things that are difficult to name, was simply not a possibility. And so I have named many of them here. And I do so in the hope not to depress you all, but because not everything that we face can be changed, but that nothing can be changed until it is faced. This is a moment at our Jubilee where there are things we need to face, and I believe facing them is a profound act of hope. We do live surrounded by a lot of death. There have been the literal deaths of the pandemic. There have been the deaths of congregations we have loved. There's the death of ways of working that we have treasured. There's the death of a church culture that perhaps nurtured and sustained us, but cannot nurture and sustain those that come after us in the same way. But death really does stand at the heart of the gospel we proclaim. A death that leads from the shock of Good Friday to the despair of divine abandonment on Holy Saturday, to the inklings of new life on Easter Sunday. We do not reach resurrection by going around death. We reach resurrection by setting our face to death. And resurrection can be strange and wondrous and fearful. Do not be afraid. Peace be with you. These are the words of the resurrected Christ to those who are indeed fearful, with hearts that were anything other than at peace. And resurrection comes at moments that are hard to spot. We might have been walking for many hours on the road with the resurrected Christ before we realize it. And resurrection comes in the profoundly ordinary, the eating of breakfast on the shoreline. Resurrection comes complete with the wounds of crucifixion, scarred and pitted flesh to touch and feel. Resurrection comes with the gift of the Holy Spirit, who sends us out and accompanies us and empowers us to do the seemingly impossible. Resurrection empowers scared disciples to set out for the ends of the world. And 2,000 years later, here we are, still being empowered, still being transformed, still being sent, still being called to make known the transforming work of God for the whole world. So let us not be afraid. Let us find peace in the midst of the list of undone things we feel guilty about having left behind. Let us both face the things that need facing and allow us to be taken out of ourselves and scooped up into the wondrous story of God's ways with the world. And so, with huge thanks to those who have made the next few days possible, I pray it will be a time of refreshment and renewal, equipping us for the vital work of ministry. Thank you.